probably in a state right now where we're going to see, as time goes on, fewer players in the market. Prices are going down. It's a race to the bottom. And you can't have a glut of generic drug manufacturers out there, 10 companies manufacturing the same drug. The market simply can't support that at the prices that are being paid right now.
Hello. Welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the third installment in our four-part series in collaboration with Hyman, Phelps McNamara, HPM, a well-known boutique law firm here in Washington, D.C. The four-part series is called Pharmaceutical Regulation, Compliance, and Policy. We're going to deal with issues such as rare diseases, compliance, enforcement, generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, all the kinds of topics that you would expect us to talk about involving pharmaceuticals. We have already had our first installment. We discussed orphan drugs and rare diseases. James Valentine and Frank Zazanowski from Hyman Phelps were on. Louise Himmelstrup, head of global regulatory affairs at Sever Therapeutics, and Kate McCurdy, who is one of the founding members of the Barth Syndrome Foundation, participated in that. That was an excellent session, as I hope all our sessions are. But if you're interested in rare diseases or orphan drugs, that's a good one to listen to. Our second installment, we discussed compliance and enforcement issues, foreign inspections, False Claims Act. We heard from three guests, all from HPM, John Claude, Pete Dickos, and Andrew Hull. And today we'll be discussing four issues: generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing. We have three guests to guide us on this journey. Of course, I want to start out, as we start the month of November, we saw the totally surprising resignation of George Tidmarsh, the director of the Center for Drugs. He was accused of using his regulatory authority to inflict financial harm on a former business associate. Originally, he was suspended and then he resigned. Obviously, his departure will have ripple effects on how some of the drug initiatives, such as the voucher program, are implemented. Obviously, this is an evolving situation, and as this situation does evolve, we'll be covering it in the podcast. Now let's meet our guest. First up is Sara Koblitz. Sara is a director at HPM at Hyman Phelps. She advises FDA-regulated clients on a range of issues, particular focus on Hatch-Waxman, patent and exclusivity, biosimilars, the Orange Book. Sara previously worked at other law firms, but most particularly when she was in law school at Duke, she clerked at the FDA Office of Policy and also at the Humane Society. Welcome to FDA Watch, Sara.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Also joining us is Karst. I've known Kurt for many decades. He's also a director at Hyman Phelps, deals with a wide range of FDA-related issues. He's a prolific writer. He's published many, many articles, but most particularly, he's the co-founder and a primary author of HPM's daily FDA law blog, which I read every day and which really always has good information. So welcome to FDA Watch, Kurt. It's good to see you.
Thanks very much, Wade. I'm excited to be here.
Finally, let's welcome Karin Hessler. She is the general counsel of the Association for Accessible Medicines, which of course deals with generic drugs and biosimilars. Before joining AAM in March 2019, she was a partner at Wiley Rein. She represented clients on intellectual property matters, special focus on patent litigation in the biotech and medical device industries. So welcome to FDA Watch, Karin.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I want to start out with a general overview question. I'm going to start with Sara, then Kurt, and then Karin. Of the four major areas that we're going to talk about, generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing, which of those areas is drawing the most concern from your clients? I want to start with Sara. Again, I'm going to repeat. Generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing. Which of those areas are your clients most interested in these days?
Well, given my practice and really the nature of the Hatch-Waxman Act, they all go hand in hand. But I think the most pressing issue is probably overseas manufacturing right now due to the looming threat of tariffs.
Okay, Kurt?
Well, similar to Sarah, I mean, they all go hand in hand. These are all interconnected things. I mean, you can't have a weak incentive for generic manufacturers under Hatch-Waxman, which really generates a lot of the money to be able to manufacture the drugs that ultimately go on shortage because they're no longer big blockbuster selling products, which goes hand in hand then with overseas manufacturing. And as Sarah mentioned, tariffs there and what that means about perhaps having to try and increase products for which there are already exceedingly thin margins, profit margins. So all of these things go together. It's like a whack-a-mole. You can't tap down one and not think that the other one is not going to be affected and pop up, and you keep doing it.
And Karin, I'm going to turn to you. Obviously, all these issues are of concern to your constituents because you are an AAM. But talk a little bit about each of these issues: generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing, and what are the biggest concerns of the industry that you represent now?
Thanks so much for the question. And I completely agree with Kurt and Sarah that these issues are all interconnected. And to Kurt's analogy, it is sort of a game of whack a mole where if you address one, you may be causing issues in another. So I'll start first with generic drugs and Hatch-Waxman. I think one of the issues that we're really encountering as a membership is that Hatch-Waxman looks a bit different nowadays than it used to look, back in the 1980s when it was originally passed. And I think one of the key points there, and this is something that Kurt and Sarah have written on previously, is patents are presenting more and more of a challenge in the context of Hatch-Waxman. So we are, as a generic industry, companies that typically challenge patents in the context of patent litigation, and Hatch-Waxman has very specific rules about how those patent litigation challenges will proceed. But one of the things we're increasingly seeing, even in the Hatch-Waxman space, it's not limited to, for example, the biologic space, is that the number of patents asserted and our ability and tools to deal with those patents is different than it used to be. We're seeing a lot more patents in the context of Hatch-Waxman, and I think just to take a step back for the audience, any patent can, preclude our entry onto the market for some period of time, which means that patients may be paying more, the healthcare system may be paying more. So we're seeing a lot more patents in the context of Hatch-Waxman. And so that in itself has created a challenge. We're also having, I think, more challenges in how we can specifically deal with those patents. There's something that we'll talk about later called a carve out that's very significant to our members and is one of the tools that has typically been in our toolbox for how to deal with this. So I think the evolving nature of Hatch-Waxman and how substantial these patent litigation cases have become has definitely been a concern. And then briefly to turn to sort of the onshoring and the tariff issue, I think one of the important things for the audience is generics. It is true that generics have typically, and this is, in the last number of years, have generally moved offshore, but I think there's some, sort of misperception about the reason for that moving offshore. A lot of that is the way that generics are ultimately reimbursed and purchased in the market, and it's really led to what we refer to as sort of race to the bottom pricing. And when you have that happen, it's going to be sort of natural that some production will move to overseas markets where there may not be the same labor costs and the like. But I think all of these things are really important to understand as to why, we're in, we have some of the considerations that we have currently. And I think why there are very specific challenges into, and we'll get into this later, but immediately onshoring, for example, these things take a very, very long period of time. So that's sort of just a brief summary of the various issues that we're dealing with. And I think to Kurt and Sarah's point, they're all very significant issues.
Right. And we're going to do a deep dive into all these topics. But I'm asking you to take out your crystal ball. And with the profit margins so low, the push to lower drug prices, the offshoring issues, how do you see the future of the generic drug industry? How is it going to be, what kind of a generic drug industry in the future are we looking at? Karin, I want to start with you because this is the area that you deal with 24 hours a day, and then turn to Sarah and Kurt.
Yeah, so I think in the future, in terms of looking into the crystal ball, I think the government really needs to sort of look at the incentive structure for our industry, both in terms of incentives to onshore production, as well as incentives to do what I talked about previously, which is to be able to challenge patents and have some sort of reward system if you effectively challenge a patent. And so I think in the future, I think in order to keep this generic drug industry sustainable, we have to sort of alter the way we're doing certain things because to my point earlier on what race to the bottom pricing, there's going to be a point at which the bottom falls out there. And so we have to keep this industry sustainable and healthy. It's a critical part of the healthcare system. 9 out of every 10 prescriptions are filled with a generic drug. So we have to keep the system working. So I think the government has to look at both how they're paying for generic drugs as well as how statutes like Hatch-Waxman and then the biologic space, the BPCIA, are working, and what are the problems that can be sort of surgically addressed to make those work better, so it's not such a dynamic of a lack of sustainability.
Yeah, Kurt, same question.
Well, right now it's looking a little grim with all of the pressures that are out there. We're probably in a state right now where we're going to see as time goes on fewer players in the market, which because of what Karin mentioned, right? Prices are going down. It's a race to the bottom, and you can't have a glut of generic drug manufacturers out there, 10 companies manufacturing the same drug. The market simply can't support that at the prices that are being paid right now. So there may be consolidation as time goes on. That's, though, of course, not to say that the total outlook here is grim, right? At some point, I am hopeful Congress will step in to cause some legislative change. And probably you're going to hear me mention this over and over, but it's really about incentives at the end of the day. Whether that is in the form of exclusivities, carve-out in the law with respect to Section 8 statements or labeling carve-outs for generic drug manufacturers, about alternative arrangements intended to incentivize generic drug development and approvals, whether that be tax incentives or voucher incentives, both for finished dosage form and for API manufacturers. I think that at the end of the day is, given the state of the generic industry, Congress is going to be pushed into have to doing something.
Yeah, Sarah, same question. Future of this industry.
Yeah, like Kurt said, I'm concerned about consolidation, turning it into a market where there are only the large players, where the smaller companies don't really have access to the market anymore because they're just driven out by the low prices. So I could foresee an exodus from the market of smaller companies. I could foresee the need for congressional intervention, but how that happens is really challenging. What would Congress do? What can Congress do to facilitate more generic entry or sustain generic entry? Because if we do see this mass consolidation or a mass exodus, we're just looking at higher drug prices for the American people.
Well, you've all mentioned congressional intervention, so let me ask you to do a little bit of a dive into that, starting with Karin. What is your agenda for the Congress? And I'm going to ask, Kurt already started to list what Congress could do, and then turn to Sarah. What would you like Congress to do in order to sustain the generic industry, which I think everybody can agree is essential if we're going to have the kind of healthcare system and the kind of pricing that we have now?
Sure. So I'll start. I think there are a number of bills that Congress has in hand, which enacting them alone would be an extreme boost to the generic drug industry. I'll start first on the issue I touched on earlier, which is patents. Patents can continue to be a major concern for us in terms of the sheer number of patents that we have to get through to bring a product to market. And I think an important thing to note about the patents is that even if a brand has greater than 100 patents, which has now arisen in the context of Hatch-Waxman as well, I think it was typically thought of as just a biologics problem. we have to, go through those patents one by one, whether we invalidate them or design around them. And if the brand has even a single claim of a single patent left standing at the end of the day, we're effectively off the market. So there are a couple of bills in this area that I think are significant, that I think would be helpful. One of which is HR 3269, which is the Ethic Act. That addresses the number of patents that can be asserted in patent litigation, and would bar brands from asserting duplicative patents. And again, sort of playing this numbers game where we have to defeat all of the patents. Another is S43, which is the Skinny Labels Big Savings Act. That's been a very important issue to AAM. There have been a couple of court cases recently that have made our ability to do what's called a skinny label, where we carve out a patented indication pursuant to statutory provisions that were provided for in the original Hatch-Waxman Act. They have made that unpredictable and uncertain. And so what FDA has proposed with this piece of legislation, it was included in FDA's budget last year, is to provide a clear safe harbor to protect skinny labeling. Again, that's a very important way for us to be able to get on the market. I think there are also payment reforms that Congress can make as well. One of the things that's been thrown around a lot as an important issue, which we agree with, is what's called PBM reform. PBMs are pharmacy benefit managers, and they've obviously played a really significant role in sort of the drug pricing calculus. There's been a lot of discussed reform around PBMs, and there are also reforms that we would like to see around things like Medicaid inflationary rebates. That's a rebate we have to pay when what's called the average manufacturer price, or AMP, of a drug goes above a specific level. And right now, the way that statute is constructed, it's not consistent with some of the changes that were made in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act with regard to inflationary rebates. And I think the biggest challenge for generic manufacturers is we may be paying inflationary rebates under Medicaid, even if the price of a drug has not actually been increased by us. So I think, that's sort of setting the table with, I think, significant reforms that can be undertaken. I'd also highlight the comments that were made by the administration last week with regard to interchangeability and clinical trials in the context of biosimilars. Those are very important reforms as well that we're very appreciative that the administration recognized the need for those reforms. But I think, as Kurt and Sara said earlier, all these issues are interconnected. And I think if you see some relief in one area, it will start sort of spilling over to other areas too. We need to be able to get to the market more quickly. And from my perspective, there needs to be a change in the way that generic drugs are paid for.
Right. Kurt, Sara, anything to add to what Karin said?
Yeah, I did. I think there are some other mentions as well, in addition to the bills that Karin had mentioned, including S1096, which is the Preserve Access to Affordable Generics and Biosimilars Act, and most importantly, S1302, HR 1843, which is the Increasing Transparency in Generic Drug Applications Act. This bill in particular would help cut a lot of red tape that is currently erected for generic drug manufacturers. For certain types of products, whether it's parenterals or otics or certain topical products, FDA's generic drug regulations say you have to be what's called Q1, Q2, the brand formulation. So that is qualitatively and quantitatively the same, with certain exceptions. In many cases, though, in order to meet that FDA regulation, generic drug manufacturers have to go through multiple rounds of submitting what's called control correspondence to FDA to try and guess what the formulation is that they have to match. And those types of correspondences they can take years sometimes with the back and forth until you come up with an acceptable formulation. And this bill would cut through all of that, giving FDA greater authority and flexibility to be able to inform generic drug manufacturers of where they may be off in their formulation, qualitatively or quantitatively, and do they need to go up, do they need to go down in terms of quantitative amounts. So that would be a significant bill. Also, I don't think Karin mentioned it, but the Remedy Act from Senator Durbin, which would essentially require brand name manufacturers who submit patent information to FDA for Orange Book listing to choose a particular patent that the 30-month stay litigation stay would apply to in that case, instead of allowing the stay in some cases to attach to multiple patents, potentially delaying generic competition.
Yeah, Sarah, anything to add to what Karin and Kurt said?
I just think that there's a lot of room for Congress to be creative, and that one that the last one that Kurt just mentioned, is really creative. It's one that we haven't seen before, and it's not just responding to a problem; it's kind of coming up with a new solution. And I think there's a lot of room for Congress to figure out incentives to more increasing manufacturing, to addressing drug shortages. There's a lot of room for Congress to play here, and it doesn't necessarily have to be something that has already been proposed. It's just a lot of thinking outside the box that needs to be done.
Right. I want to shift gears a little bit. Since our podcast is FDA Watch, I want to ask you about FDA's performance here. I want to start with you, Sarah. How is FDA doing in terms of managing generic drugs, in terms of getting them through, in terms of to the extent that they can even do anything, is providing incentives for more generic drugs? How's FDA doing these days?
Well, it's been a low year for approvals, so for generic approvals. So it isn't doing the best that it can, but whether that has to do with the number of products that are coming through FDA and OGD, or the number of approvals that are going through, I can't say because I don't have insight into that. But I do know that OGD has been doing their best in this really tumultuous environment, and I think that they're doing kind of the best that they can do.
Yeah, Kurt?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm just gonna look. There's a pre-GDUFA era and a post-GDUFA era at FDA when we're talking about generic drugs, right? So going back to 2012 when GDUFA was enacted, and over the past now 13 years plus, I think FDA has significantly improved things in the generic drug world. Applications, although it's not terribly common, there are applications that do get approval within the first review cycle, and sometimes even sooner. And so that's great and all. And then the number of approvals, if you do look historically over the past several years, are pretty significant. But I don't think it's really about the approvals at the end of the day, because an approval is only so good as somebody launching on that approval. And if I've got 25 approvals for generic Entresto, while that number looks good, only 2 or 3 of those companies at the end of the day are really going to be able to launch successfully here. So again, we need to increase incentives to have better launches and more profitable launches for generic drug manufacturers, not just numbers of approvals, I would say.
Karin, FDA?
I very much agree with what Kurt and Sarah just said. I think FDA has been doing the best it can despite challenging circumstances, and they've certainly approved a number of generic drugs. I very much sort of want to second what Kurt just said, though, that approval is sort of one part of the equation that presents a challenge for us. We then have to be able to launch the product. And again, that goes back to the patent issue I just discussed earlier. And then the market we launch into needs to be sustainable. So again, these are all interconnected issues where obviously it's critical to get FDA approval for a drug, but that alone is not going to determine whether or not we can successfully launch the product. And it may in fact be many years before we can successfully launch a product if there are a number of patents standing in the way. So it's one part of the equation, but I agree with Sarah's sentiment from earlier that FDA has been doing well despite a variety of challenging circumstances.
Right. And without asking you to get into the Tidmarsh situation, because I know we don't know the details there, what does a center director, we have a new management, we're going to have still new management at Cedar. What would you want, it's just for Karin, what would you want a center director coming in to do with regard to generic drugs?
I think having transparency is critical and to have very strong scientific expertise and experience. But I think transparency from the agency is always critical, sort of elucidating what the standards are for approval and applying them consistently, because obviously we have a number of different folks who are getting approved on the same product. But I keep coming back to the word transparency. I think that's really important.
Good. I want to turn to Hatch-Waxman. Believe it or not, I was involved in the development of that legislation. I represented the companies that split off from the PMA at the time and were lobbying. I was deeply involved in that. I always describe it as one of the most interesting experiences I've had. That law is so complex. When we had to go up to Capitol Hill to explain it, most of the lobbyists, the general lobbyists who were involved in that, could not explain the details of the law. There were, certain attorneys who had participated in the drafting who were able to explain it. And since then, it's been, as we all know, fairly complex. So I want to ask Kurt, because I know, Kurt, you've been involved in it for a long time, start out. How do you think Hatch-Waxman has done over the last 40 years or so? And does it need to change? I want to ask you to, do it briefly. I don't want you to start explaining Hatch-Waxman, but I know that you can do that, and you'll only embarrass me because I can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, overall, Wayne, I think Hatch-Waxman has been a smashing success, right? For the generic drug industry, obviously, but also for the American healthcare system. I mean, the hundreds of billions of dollars that have certainly been saved over the decades is unbelievable. And of course, that doesn't mean it's a perfect law, right? I mean, the Hatch-Waxman was intended to have this balance between incentivizing new drug development and also incentivizing generic competition. And over the years, you've seen it get a little out of whack. And when that has happened, Congress has stepped in. 2003, for example, with the passage of the Medicare Modernization Act, which significantly changed how Hatch-Waxman operates, including 180-day exclusivity. It's now been 22 years, right, since the MMA was passed. Is it perhaps time for Congress again to step in and further refine that law? And I would argue yes. I mean, could we have a Hatch-Waxman 2.0? Perhaps something with a more significant incentive for generic drug manufacturers, whatever that may be. We could go on all day talking about what those potential incentives should be. But I would argue that we are at the point now where it is probably something where we should dust off the 20-some years of the MMA and the 40-plus years since the original Hatch-Waxman was enacted to go back and take a fresh look at the law and how we can sustain and better build a strong generic drug industry.
Yeah, Karin, does your organization have any position on Hatch-Waxman?
It's very similar to what Kurt just articulated. Hatch-Waxman has obviously been an incredible success that effectively created the modern generic drug industry. And so much credit has to be given for the work that ultimately led to Hatch-Waxman in the years of implementation. I do very much agree with what Kurt just said, though, that fundamentally things change over time. We've increasingly see brands sort of develop new loopholes that can be sort of weaponized. There are new barriers to access that over time need to be specifically addressed. And so I agree with Kurt's general sentiment that the original Hatch-Waxman was great, but it needs periodic sort of modernizations to make sure we're capturing current behavior and also ensuring that the generic industry, which is completely different today than it was back in the 80s, that the current generic industry is sort of getting what it needs to be a successful industry that, again, is supplying 9 out of every 10 prescriptions. But to Kurt's, a word that Kurt used earlier, it's sort of grim in terms of the sustainability of that industry.
Okay, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. We're going to talk about drug shortages. I'm going to ask Sara the first question about drug shortages, and we're going to be talking about overseas manufacturing. And we're back. We're talking to Hyman Phelps attorneys Sara Koblitz and Karst and Karin Hessler of the Association for Accessible Medicines. I would just make one note. It's very interesting when Hatch-Waxman or Waxman-Hacks was originally passed. If you were a Democrat, you said it was the Waxman-Hatch law. If you were Republicans, you said it was Hatch-Waxman. It's interesting that it's turned out to be Hatch-Waxman after all these 40 years. Both Orrin Hatch and Henry Waxman were intimately involved, very knowledgeable about that legislation, even though it was very complex. Again, I was involved in that and remember dealing with both of them. It's not common that you deal with an actual senator or an actual representative about the details of legislation, but both of them wanted to create a generic drug industry, but also protect the rest of the industry. And as I think we're all in agreement that it's been very, very successful. Turn to drug shortages. Sara, I'm going to ask you just a general question. Drug shortages have been a problem for a long time. It doesn't get any better. There are several hundred drugs at any point in time that are in shortage. What needs to be done about the drug shortage problem? What can anybody do about it?
I wish I had a great answer for that. I wish there was some hole that I could tell you that Congress could fill. But we did see with the shortage of the GLP-1s that compounding can really fill that hole. I mean, that comes with all sorts of risks and everything. But that shows that the market is out there and that there is some way to fill that need. It's just a matter of getting some companies interested in actually filling that need. They already get priority review for shortages. And exclusivity wouldn't make any sense. Obviously, we wouldn't want to nudge other companies out of the market if they are trying to fill this hole. So I think that there needs to be a creative solution to come up with it, and maybe we can glean something from the success that compounding had during the GLP-1 shortages.
Sara, just to follow up on that, is the drug shortage situation going to get worse, or is it going to get better?
I think it's only going to get worse as long as FDA keeps inspecting. We're seeing a lot of problems, especially in the sterile injectable market, because they're really difficult to get right. And I think that the more sophisticated FDA gets with its reviews and its inspections, the more likelihood there are of these facilities having problems, and facilities having problems leads to shutdowns of facilities, applications unable to get approval because of their facilities not being sufficient, and delays in approval because of the corrections that need to go on to address those manufacturing defects. So I do think that the problem is going to get worse.
Yeah, Karin, same questions as for Sara. What needs to be done with drug shortage, and is it going to get better or worse?
Thank you so much. So I think with drug shortage, the critical issue remains the economics of the generic industry. A number of studies, including one from the Senate Finance Committee, have shown that economics are the primary driver of drug shortages, that a substantial proportion of drug shortages are in low per unit net cost drugs, that there's not really an economic viability for manufacturers to continue to manufacture them. And this really goes back to the structure of the generic drug market. We have 200 or more manufacturers selling into 3 consolidated buyers who control approximately 78% of the market in the retail space and a comparable amount of the market in the hospital space. And when you have that extreme sort of price deflation and race to the bottom on pricing, companies are going to make the reasonable and rational decision that certain drugs are not economically viable in terms of producing anymore. So in terms of the question of how to address drug shortages, the economics of the generic drug industry must be addressed. And I agree with Sara's sentiment that Unless those economic issues are addressed and that we prioritize the generic drug market and how generic drugs are paid for, we're going to continue to see these same types of shortages where the economics are just not there. So companies make the decision to leave the market, and then you eventually get a shortage if you have, for example, some unexpected spike in demand, which has happened in a number of flu seasons and the like. We really, I'll say it again and again, we have to fix the economics of the generic drug industry if we want to affirmatively address shortages.
Kurt, same question.
Yeah, so Wayne, Karen hit the nail on the head. It is all about the economics here. You have products that are going into shortage, which are typically the off-patent, off-exclusivity drugs that are costly to produce with little or no profit margin for the generics. Okay, so let's then look at Hatch-Waxman and how it plays into shortages. So if you have, as we have right now, a 180-day exclusivity incentive, and that will be on these, typically the new brand name drugs out there. If you have a relatively hollow incentive, right, where you have 10 companies or 20 companies that can all qualify for this exclusivity, it's kind of a meaningless exclusivity. And in fact, there's legislation pending in Congress, the Blocking Act, that would dilute that exclusivity even more. And it's the profits that the generic drug companies get from their 180-day exclusivity incentive, oftentimes, that helps fund the manufacture of the off-patent exclusivity drugs that only generic manufacturers are making, and are the ones that typically go into shortage. So you have to have a much stronger incentive on the paragraph 4 patent challenge 180-day exclusivity front in order to help strengthen the generic drug industry so that it can supply the off-patent exclusivity drugs that brand name manufacturers aren't going to manufacture and that go into shortage. Now, Congress has stepped in to some extent. Back in, I think it was 2017, they created this new type of exclusivity called CGT, Competitive Generic Therapy Exclusivity. And there have been many now approvals. I think it has certainly helped some. FDA a few weeks ago, I believe, or a month ago, came out with a new policy of trying to grant expedited review to certain ANDAs where the products are manufactured in the United States. Bioequivalence studies are conducted in the United States. Unfortunately, that probably affects very few generic drug manufacturers out there and certainly very few products. But I certainly like the thinking behind it, right? That the agency itself can perhaps develop new policies to prioritize generic drug applications for approval to offset shortages. But I think more needs to be done. And that goes back to what incentives can Congress create to incentivize companies to go after the drug shortage products.
Final series of questions, drug manufacturing. I want to ask each of you to briefly, all of you mentioned, I think, tariffs before. I want to deal with that very briefly and then get into the larger issue of moving manufacturing into the U.S. Tariff question. Let's start with Karin. How do you think the proposed tariffs will impact the generic market?
Thank you so much for the question. So I think the proposal on tariffs has been modified a few times, and I think the administration has done a really good job in terms of listening to stakeholder concerns and getting feedback from stakeholders about the potential for additional drug shortages and concerns around you don't want to have sort of a repeat of some of the shortages that we've had in the past that have been really problematic in terms of continuity of patient care. So I think the administration has done a good job in listening to stakeholder concerns. What we've seen from the Wall Street Journal article, and obviously none of this is finalized, and this was just something that was in the Wall Street Journal, is a suggestion that the administration may not have 232 tariffs specifically on generic medicines. We will obviously wait to see what is finalized by the administration, but I think if the administration were to come to that conclusion, that would reflect a very sound judgment that tariffs, particularly on extremely low margin products, could lead to shortages. There are also other categories of tariffs that are out there, including reciprocal tariffs, which is going to be the subject of a Supreme Court oral argument. And there's been several specific buckets of tariffs that are really tied to specific countries as well. So we're obviously waiting to see what the administration will do. We've obviously put in comments that have articulated the viewpoint that tariffs on very low margin generics could have very significant impacts in terms of shortages. And we're heartened to see some of the movement from the Wall Street Journal article, but obviously want to wait to see what the administration does and finalize.
Okay. I do really want to move on to one final topic, and that has to do with manufacturing. As we all know, a lot of generic drugs are manufactured overseas. Is it feasible to move some of that domestically, as this administration has indicated it wants to do? Is that realistic? Are the foreign manufacturers, India, China, other countries, Ireland, are they having special challenges because of the way that FDA is viewing this issue? It's highly unusual for FDA to be taking the position that we want to give incentives to domestic manufacturers, but that's basically where they are and where they're headed. So let me start out with you, Kurt, and then turn to Sara, and then Karin, you have the last word. Talk generally about this issue of overseas manufacturing and what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, this comes down to the concept of onshoring, Wayne, right? And is it feasible? I mean, sure, anything is feasible. I guess the issue is it practical, right? Folks expect their generic drugs to be priced at X. If it's manufactured in the United States, it would have to be priced at Y, which is going to be higher than price X. And we can't have our cake and eat it too at the end of the day, right? So if there is going to be a effort to onshore generic drug manufacturing in the United States, then there has to be a commensurate incentive to do so that augment the economic situation here at the end of the day. So we have to have some offsetting factor to account for the additional costs that the industry would be asked to bear by onshoring manufacturing in the United States.
Sara?
Yeah, and I think you need to consider all of the overhead that goes into the creation of a new facility domestically, and the fact that land and procuring everything you need to build a factory is just so much more expensive here. It's going to raise the prices. If you look at the foreign at the user fees for manufacturing facilities, there's only a $20,000 difference between the domestic FDF facility fee and the foreign FDF facility fee. So I think that there's a lot of room there for FDA to try and incentivize the domestic facility fee by changing the user fee structure, if that's what they want to do. But I'm not sure that it's going to be feasible given all of the investment that's going to take, particularly because these products are so low margin.
Karin, final word.
I again completely agree with what Kurt and Sara said, and I would add the additional point that in terms of the amount of time it would take to onshore, that would be measured in years, not months or days. We are a highly regulated industry where, to Sara's point, facilities need to be inspected, and it takes even more time, obviously, to construct and move a facility. This is something that would take years, and I think is very different from other industries that are not as highly regulated as us. And just to touch on Kurt's point earlier about the economics, there has to be an incentive, and there has to be strong governmental support for prioritizing, if they choose to go in this direction, domestically manufactured drugs, whether it be the finishing of the domestic drug or the API sourcing. Again, that's something that would take years and would need significant support from the government, because as I mentioned earlier, we are 200 plus manufacturers selling into 3 heavily consolidated purchasers who singularly prioritize price. And obviously, the US has, for example, higher labor standards than other countries. And so for the US to attempt to equalize on price is really difficult, if not impossible. And so there has to be an incentive and has to be a recognition of sort of the differential standards across countries, and there has to be a priority placed on creating a strong and resilient domestic supply chain.
Okay. On that note, I want to thank Sara Koblitz, Karst, Karin Hessler. Great discussion. This is the third installment of the 4-part series that we're doing in collaboration with HBM, Hyman, Phelps McNamara. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind everybody about our website, fdawatch.net. You don't want to miss part 4 of this series with HPM or any episode of FDA Watch. The only way to assure that you will be notified is to subscribe. And the way to subscribe is to go to fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net, and you can subscribe. It's free, and you will get notices whenever we post a podcast. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch.